Welcome to our course on health law and medical legislation. We're starting with Chapter 1, Legal and Regulatory Framework in Health, based on the book El Arte de la Medicina en el Marco de la Ley, or The Art of Medicine Within the Framework of Law. Let me begin by sharing a quote that sets the tone for this chapter, and for much of what we'll be exploring together. Las leyes no son invenciones arbitrarias, sino la manifestación escrita de los principios que rigen la convivencia en sociedad. No deben reducirse a simples designios de una autoridad, sino ser el eco estructurado del deber ser que la comunidad materializa para garantizar su libertad y justicia, which we can translate as, laws are not arbitrary inventions, they are the written expression of the principles that shape social life. They must not be reduced to mere commands from authority, but seen as the structured echo of what ought to be, crafted by society to preserve justice and freedom. This quote reminds us that laws in healthcare are not just external impositions. They reflect deeper ethical and moral agreements about what it means to live and care for others in a fair and dignified society. So throughout this chapter, we won't just memorize laws or regulations. We're going to explore why they exist, how they relate to our values, and how they impact your day-to-day clinical practice as future physicians. The main goal of this chapter is to help you understand how ethics, morality, and law interact in medical practice. Now, you might be thinking, aren't those things a bit abstract? Why should I worry about them as a medical student? Well, the truth is, these three pillars, ethics, morality, and law, are not theoretical ideas. They're part of everyday decisions in hospitals and clinics. From the moment you speak to a patient, recommend a treatment, request a signature, or even just document a case, you are moving within these three frameworks. Throughout this chapter, we'll clarify the differences between each one, ethics, morality, and law, and we'll look at how they influence medical decisions, both separately and in combination. We'll also explore the legal structure that regulates healthcare in Mexico, not to turn you into lawyers, but to give you the tools to practice medicine responsibly and confidently. More importantly, we'll talk about how to integrate these three elements, especially when they seem to be in conflict, because sooner or later, you will face a situation where what feels morally right, what's ethically correct, and what the law allows don't match. And in those moments, understanding these concepts can make all the difference. Let's take a closer look at the three foundational forces that shape every decision in healthcare: ethics, morality, and law. These aren't abstract ideas. They show up in real clinical scenarios every day. Ethics refers to professional principles. It asks, what should I do as a doctor to act with integrity and responsibility? Ethics is based on universal values like autonomy, justice, and compassion. It offers a structured way to reflect before acting. Morality, on the other hand, is personal. It comes from your upbringing, your beliefs, your culture, your religion. It also comes from the patient's background, which may differ completely from yours. Law is the third pillar. It is the set of rules established by society to regulate what we can and can't do. Unlike ethics or morality, the law is binding. It comes with consequences when it's broken, but also with protection when it's respected. Now here's the important part. These three forces don't always point in the same direction. Something might feel ethically right, but go against the patient's moral beliefs. Something might be legally allowed, but ethically questionable. So how do we respond? By learning to recognize these dimensions in every case, and by building the skills to deliberate, not just clinically, but ethically, morally, and legally. Let's start by focusing on ethics, the professional compass that helps guide our behavior as healthcare providers. Ethics isn't a rigid rulebook. It's a reflective framework. It helps us ask important questions like, what's the right thing to do for this patient? Am I honoring their dignity? Am I acting fairly and responsibly? Ethics in medicine is grounded in universal values. It doesn't depend on where you live or what religion you follow. It's meant to help all professionals in all systems act with consistency and humanity. These values include respect for life, autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. And we'll go deeper into those in the next slide. But for now, just remember this. Ethics helps us when the law is unclear and when emotions are high. It invites us to pause, to think, and to respond with both professionalism and compassion. In Mexico, this idea is even recognized legally. The Ley General de Salud, Article 51, that's the general health law, states that care must be delivered in a professional and ethical manner. It's not just a suggestion, it's a legal obligation. So when you practice medicine ethically, you're not only doing the right thing, you're also building trust, avoiding harm, and staying within the bounds of the law. Medical ethics is often summarized in 4 core principles. These principles aren't laws, but they're widely recognized as the foundation of ethical decision-making in healthcare. Let's go through each one. Autonomy means respecting the patient's right to make decisions about their own body and treatment. Even if we don't agree with their choice, we must ensure they are well-informed and free from coercion. Beneficence is the duty to do good, to promote the patient's health and well-being, to relieve suffering, to act with compassion. It's one of the most intuitive principles in medicine. Non-maleficence is closely related. It means avoiding harm. We all know the phrase, first, do no harm. But in real practice, this also means weighing risks carefully and avoiding unnecessary interventions. And justice refers to fairness. Every patient should be treated equitably, regardless of gender, age, income, language, or any other factor. Justice also asks us to be conscious of how we allocate time, resources, and access to care. Now, these principles are not always in perfect balance. Sometimes they conflict. For example, what if respecting autonomy leads to a decision that causes harm? Or what if doing good for one patient delays care for another? That's why ethics isn't about memorizing the right answer. It's about weighing these principles together, using judgment, and thinking carefully in each case. In Mexico, these principles are reflected in the Ley General de Salud, Article 51, and in the Norma Oficial Mexicana 004, which regulates clinical documentation. So yes, ethical decisions must also be documented properly. The law recognizes that your ethical reasoning matters, and it should be visible in the patient's record. Now let's talk about morality, a force that is just as real and powerful as ethics, but much more personal. While ethics is based on professional standards, morality comes from each individual's beliefs and values. It may be shaped by religion, culture, upbringing, or personal experience. In the clinical setting, morality can influence both patients and healthcare providers. For example, a doctor might have personal objections to performing a certain procedure. A patient might decline treatment because of their faith. A family might request a traditional remedy instead of conventional medicine. These situations happen all the time, and they can lead to tension, especially when beliefs clash with medical judgment or hospital protocols. The key is to remember, morality varies from person to person. What feels absolutely right for one person may be unacceptable for another. In Mexico, the legal framework acknowledges this complexity. La Ley General de Salud, Article 77 bis 7, recognizes the importance of cultural diversity in healthcare, and in 2017, La Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación, the Supreme Court of Mexico, confirmed the right to conscientious objection for medical professionals. However, that right has limits. Care must not be interrupted or denied. The patient's access to services must be guaranteed. So, while morality deserves respect, it must be balanced carefully with professional ethics and legal obligations. That's not always easy, but it is essential to good, human-centered medicine. Let's look at some real-world examples where moral beliefs directly affect clinical care. A patient refuses a blood transfusion because it goes against her religion. A physician decides not to prescribe contraceptives due to personal convictions. A family insists on using traditional remedies, even when the hospital offers a different plan of care. These aren't just hypotheticals, they're everyday situations in medical practice. In these moments, morality enters the room, and the decisions we make can't be based only on clinical evidence. We also have to consider beliefs, values, and human dignity. But there's a limit. Respecting moral beliefs does not mean we can ignore our ethical duties or break the law. For example, if a patient refuses a treatment, we must ensure that refusal is informed, voluntary, and properly documented. In Mexico, this is explicitly regulated. The General Health Law, Articles 77, bis 35 and 36, state that patients have the right to refuse treatment, but their decision must be informed and recorded. And La Norma Oficial Mexicana 004, specifically, Sections 5.5.6 and 5.6.5, requires us to document patient refusals, explain the implications, and offer alternative options when possible. So, what's the takeaway? Moral beliefs matter. They must be heard and respected, but they must also be handled within a framework that protects both the patient and the healthcare provider. That's the balance we strive for, one that honors belief without compromising care. Now let's move to the third pillar, the law. Unlike ethics or morality, the law is not optional. It defines what we are allowed to do, what we must do, and what we absolutely cannot do in medical practice. The law protects patients by guaranteeing their rights, things like access to care, privacy, and informed decision-making. And it protects healthcare professionals too, by providing a clear framework for action and responsibility. So, what are some examples of legal duties? We must obtain informed consent before procedures. We must maintain accurate and complete clinical records. We must ensure that every patient receives dignified and non-discriminatory care. In Mexico, this legal structure comes from several key sources. First, La Constitución Política de los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, Article 4, establishes the right to health protection. Then, we have La Ley General de Salud, the General Health Law, which regulates how healthcare services must be organized and delivered. And of course, Las Normas Oficiales Mexicanas, or NOMS, are mandatory technical standards. One of the most important for us is La Norme 004 SSA 32012, which sets the rules for managing clinical records. There are also legal consequences for malpractice. El Código Penal Federal, Articles 228 to 231, outlines professional liability and defines what constitutes criminal negligence in healthcare. So, to summarize, the law gives us boundaries, but also protection. If we act within those boundaries, we're not only caring responsibly, we're also protecting ourselves and our patients. Let's bring the law down from theory into the clinic, because in real life, legal standards shape everything we do, even in the most routine moments. Take informed consent, for example. It's not just a signature on a form, it's a process. You're required to explain the procedure, its benefits, risks, and alternatives, and make sure the patient truly understands. That conversation, and their response, must be documented. Then there's the clinical record. It's not just for continuity of care, it's also a legal document. It can be reviewed by auditors, legal authorities, or the patient themselves. If it's incomplete or inaccurate, it can put your entire case and your reputation at risk. And what about dignified care? Every patient, no matter their background, is entitled to be treated with respect and equality. This includes how they're spoken to, how procedures are explained, and even how waiting times or treatments are assigned. In Mexico, the law makes all this very clear. La Constitución, in Articles 4 and 5, guarantees the right to health and the right to practice a profession under the law. El Código Civil Federal, Artículo 1910, states that anyone who causes harm by action or omission must repair that damage, including in healthcare. The NOM 004 SSA 32012 requires that all clinical documentation be clear, complete, and reflect what actually occurred. So no, the law is not just for extreme cases or legal departments. It's part of your daily work as a physician, and knowing how to apply it can make the difference between a defensible decision and a preventable error. Let's look at a real-world example, a clinical dilemma where ethics, morality, and law don't align easily. Picture this. A 35-year-old woman just had surgery. She starts bleeding and urgently needs a blood transfusion. She's alert and fully aware of her situation, and she refuses the transfusion because of her religious beliefs. What should the medical team do? From an ethical perspective, the team wants to save her life. From a moral perspective, the patient is exercising her deeply held beliefs. From a legal perspective, the patient has the right to make an informed refusal, even if the decision carries serious consequences. This is the kind of situation where none of the answers feel entirely right, and yet a decision must be made. So, how do we approach it? In this case, the team consulted the hospital's ethics committee. They confirmed that the patient had been fully informed. Everything was documented carefully in the clinical record. They explored other treatment options that respected her decision, and they continued to care for her with the same dedication and respect. In Mexico, this type of case is supported by legal provisions. La Ley General de Salud, Articles 77 bis 35 and 36 confirms the patient's right to refuse treatment when properly informed, and La Norme 004-SSA 3-2012, in sections 5.5.6 and 5.6.5, requires full documentation of any refusal, including alternatives offered. So what do we learn from this? That these situations can't be solved with just one lens. They require ethical clarity, respect for moral values, and strict legal compliance, all working together. And most importantly, they remind us that medicine is as much about human dignity as it is about clinical decisions. Let's take a moment to reflect on how we're trained as healthcare professionals. Medical school teaches us anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and many essential clinical skills. But how much attention is given to ethics, morality, and law? More and more programs include courses on bioethics and medical legislation. That's a good sign, but there's often a disconnect between what we learn in theory and what happens in real-life practice. For example, we may know the definition of informed consent, but have you ever seen it done properly in a hospital setting? We're taught to respect patient autonomy, but do we know how to handle a refusal? Do we know how to document it legally? We hear that there's an ethics committee, but do we really understand its role? Have we been invited to observe or participate? This gap matters, because when students aren't exposed to real ethical and legal decision-making, they enter the profession with uncertainty, or worse, with habits that don't align with the law. That's why medical education must go beyond clinical training. It must also teach us to think ethically, to respect the moral beliefs of others, and to apply legal standards in our daily work. In Mexico, La Ley General de Salud, Article 61, calls for training in ethical and legal responsibilities, and organizations like ConBioética, the National Bioethics Commission, have developed guidelines to help schools meet that goal, because knowing how to treat disease is important, but knowing how to care for people, with conscience and legal awareness, is what truly defines good medicine. There's something every future doctor needs to understand early on. Knowing the law protects you. Many professionals think the law exists only to punish. But in reality, when you understand and apply legal standards, the law becomes your ally. It creates a safe framework where you can practice medicine with confidence. Let me give you a few examples. If you don't obtain or properly document informed consent, even if you had the best intentions, you could face legal consequences. If you forget to record something important in the patient's file, especially during an emergency, that omission could be used against you. If you ignore a norma official mexicana, one of the mandatory standards, and a complication occurs, your actions will be evaluated based on that standard. In short, good documentation, legal awareness, and adherence to national standards are your best protection. In Mexico, this is clear in several laws. El Código Penal Federal, Articles 228 to 231, defines malpractice and outlines professional liability. La Norme 004 SSA 3 2012 requires accurate and complete clinical records. And La Ley General de Salud, Articles 77 bis 35 and 36, confirms the legal weight of informed consent and patient autonomy. So even though you're not expected to be a legal expert, you are expected to act within the law and to prove it when needed, because in the end, legal knowledge is not just a safeguard, it's part of what makes you a trustworthy and responsible physician. This slide brings everything together, because in clinical reality, the most responsible decisions are made when we learn to balance ethics, morality, and law, not treat them as separate elements. Every time we're faced with a difficult decision, we should ask ourselves 3 questions. Is this ethically correct based on professional principles? Does it respect the moral values of the patient and my own? Am I acting within the limits of the law and documenting my decision appropriately? Let's take an example. A terminally ill patient requests euthanasia. As a physician, you might understand their suffering and feel that the request is ethically justifiable. You might even feel morally inclined to help. But in Mexico, euthanasia is not legally permitted. So what do? You acknowledge the patient's suffering. You explore legal alternatives, like palliative sedation. You document everything, and you make sure the patient and their family feel heard and supported. That's how you apply all 3 pillars. By thinking clearly, respecting deeply, and acting lawfully. In this context, the following apply. The NOM 004 SSA 3 2012 requires that decisions be fully justified and documented. The Ley General de Salud, Article 51, demands ethical and professional conduct. And the Código de Ética del Profesional de la Salud provides guidance for ethical behavior in challenging situations. So don't think of these pillars as separate checkboxes. Think of them as tools you can use, together, to care better, decide smarter, and protect everyone involved. Let's revisit the clinical case we mentioned earlier, this time to analyze how all 3 pillars interact in practice. A 35-year-old woman urgently needs a blood transfusion after surgery. She is alert, understands the situation, and clearly refuses the transfusion due to her religious beliefs. From a medical point of view, her condition is serious. The team knows the transfusion could save her life. But here's the challenge. Ethically, the team wants to act out of beneficence, to do good and prevent harm. Morally, they recognize and want to respect the patient's deeply held convictions. Legally, they must honor her right to refuse treatment, as long as she's informed and competent. So, what did the team do? They consulted the hospital's ethics committee. They thoroughly explained all available options. The patient reaffirmed her refusal. Then, they carefully documented everything in the clinical record, including her reasoning, the alternatives discussed, and the medical plan moving forward. This allowed them to continue providing care without violating her rights or their own ethical standards. In Mexico, this kind of case is addressed directly in La Ley General de Salud, Articles 77 bis 35 and 36, where patient autonomy and the right to refuse treatment are protected. La Norme 004 SSA 3 2012, Sections 5.5.6 and 5.6.5, which require documentation of refusals and the reasoning behind them. And El Código Civil Federal, Article 7, which gives legal value to voluntary decisions made by competent individuals. This case reminds us that sometimes we can't solve a dilemma, but we can navigate it with dignity, empathy, and responsibility. That's what it means to practice medicine with full awareness. We've reached the end of this first chapter, and I'd like to close with a reflection. Being a physician isn't just about having medical knowledge. It's about knowing how to make decisions, especially when the answers aren't easy. And in medicine, making the right decision means asking yourself 3 simple but powerful questions. Is this ethically sound? Am I respecting the values and beliefs of the patient? Am I acting within the law and documenting it properly? These questions may seem basic, but they reflect something deeper. They're not about choosing between ethics, morality, or law. They're about learning how to bring them together. Throughout this course, we'll study more laws, standards, and real cases. But all of that has one purpose: to help you become a physician who acts with clarity, compassion, and legal confidence. In Mexico, this expectation is supported by El Código de Ética del Profesional de la Salud, the code of ethics that guides our profession. La Ley General de Salud, Article 2, which recognizes the right to health protection, and La Norme 004 SSA 3-2012, which ensures that our clinical reasoning and ethical conduct are reflected in our documentation. Because when you combine technical skill with ethical reflection, respect for beliefs, and legal awareness, then you're not just practicing medicine, you're practicing the art of medicine within the framework of the law.